Well, welcome everybody. I'm Dan Glickman, Director of the Institute of Politics, and we want to welcome you all to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum tonight. Tonight we'll discuss the title, The New Eugenics, the Brave New World of Designer Children, Bionic Athletes, and Genetic Engineering. Now, as a former Secretary of Agriculture, I am familiar with both the benefits as well as the alleged detriments of genetic engineering when it comes to crops and livestock. While the debate over agriculture-related engineering was and is intense, it pales in comparison to the debate we face when it comes to human genetic engineering. Which reminds me, I recently looked at my new grandson. He was beautiful, of course, and as I gazed at him, I wondered about what his life would be like, what familial traits of mine he would carry on. I could see him one day growing up to be 6'4", with a thick head of blonde hair and big blue eyes. Like any father or grandfather, I wondered which gifts would he be able to share with the rest of the world. And up until just a few years ago, that's how many parents looked at their children's future. It was a crapshoot. It was luck. A parent couldn't control his own genetics or his kid's genetics or nature. Well, that's probably not true anymore. The discussion we'll have this evening and the debate countless scholars and theologians are having around the world is profound. Do we dare play God? Do we want a boy or a girl? Would you like your child to be tall or of medium height, green eyes or blue? If we do play God, how far should we go? And if we go too far, what will that do to society? It's ironic, or perhaps perfectly appropriate, that we're having this debate at a time when we are witnessing an emergence of religious fundamentalism in the United States. That is a movement where many believe that only God should be the one to decide these questions, not human beings. To help us understand the challenges ahead of us in this brave new world, we are pleased to have some of the best minds in this field. First, we will hear a short talk from Professor Michael Sandel, and then we will hear brief responses from Professor Steven Pinker and Brent Coffin. We will have a brief conversation on stage, and then we'll open it up to Q&As. Let me introduce Professor Sandel. Many of you already know him. His undergraduate course on justice has enrolled over 10,000 students, making it one of the most popular courses in Harvard's history. In 1985, he was awarded the Harvard Radcliffe Phi Beta Kappa Teaching Prize, and in 1999, he was named a Harvard College professor in recognition of his contributions to undergraduate teaching. He's lectured all over the world and has had fellowships from the Carnegie Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the American Council of Learned Societies. He delivered the Tanner Lectures on Human Values at Oxford in 1998, and was a visiting professor at the Sorbonne in 2001. His book, Liberalism and the Limits of Justice and Democracy's Discontent, America in Search of a Public Philosophy, is in its second edition and it has been translated into 7 different languages. We are honored to have with us this evening Professor Michael Sandel.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. Thanks for that introduction, and to all of you for coming, and to my co-panelists for being willing to join in this discussion. I'd like to begin by mentioning a few examples of genetic engineering and enhancement, then see what people think about it, how you would react to it, how you would assess it morally, then try to sort out the some objections that are commonly raised against attempts at genetic engineering and enhancement, and then finally to offer one objection, difficult to articulate, but I'll see what I can do to see whether you find any of the objections, including that one, persuasive. Take a few examples. First of all, a lot of the discussion of genetic engineering veers off into science fiction, into scenarios that are not likely either ever to happen or to happen anytime soon. So I would like to mention a few that are either currently available or at least plausibly on the horizon. There is a laboratory at the University of Pennsylvania that has super strong, bulked up mice. These are researchers there have found a way of triggering the gene that controls muscle growth. They were hoping to come up with a cure for muscular dystrophy, but Among those who are most interested in their bulked up mice are coaches and athletes, because the same gene therapy that would cure atrophied muscles would also work, and it's worked in the mice, in perfectly healthy muscles to make them even stronger. So question number one, what about genetically altered athletes? It's not all that hypothetical. Even now we read lots about steroid-enhanced athletes hitting more home runs than Babe Ruth ever was able to hit. But suppose now steroids are unsafe, they're banned, the ban is now only beginning to be enforced in baseball, but in other sports there is a ban on steroids. They're harmful long-term health effects. But suppose the gene therapy didn't have long-term health effects. In fact, there's reason to think that it won't. What would you think of genetically altered, super strong athletes, whether in the Tour de France or in the NFL or in Major League Baseball or the Olympics? In fact, the Olympics is beginning to worry about this even now, because the usual blood tests that they take or the urine tests for drugs don't seem as though they will work for the genetically altered athlete. Case number one. Case number two, another group of mice who have nearly photographic memories. Actually, it's some fruit flies that had photographic memories. Some mice have had their memories enhanced genetically, at least in the limited sense of memory that involves simple associations. Human memory is a lot more complicated than simply correlating, a kind of Pavlovian response, as was developed in the case of the enhanced mice. But there are now pharmaceutical companies, biotech companies, that are trying to develop what they call cognition enhancers, ways of intervening genetically to improve the memory, or at least some features of memory, for human beings. Now, their market is not only those who have Alzheimer's. It's not only a matter of therapy and repair. The much bigger market consists of those in their 50s and beyond who experience natural age-related memory loss. Some say this would be, if it were developed, a Viagra for the brain. So that's example number two. Third example is a practice already available to pediatricians and endocrinologists. This involves the use of human growth hormone to enhance height. It's been the case for some years that the FDA approved human growth hormone for kids who suffer from hormone deficiencies. That's therapy. That's to try to lift them up to the norm. But what about otherwise healthy but simply short kids who have short parents? Why shouldn't they be able to have human growth hormone too? The FDA has been wrestling with this question. They made a small exception for very, very short kids, but why stop there? What about kids who have average height or even above average height but want to be taller to make the basketball team, for example? Is there any distinction in principle between curing a kind of disease or a deficiency and using the same intervention to lift people above the norm? Fourth case, also already practiced. You can now choose the sex of your children. This is something you can look forward to. For millennia, people have been coming up with folk remedies to choose a boy or a girl, but now it's possible in two ways at least. One way is for those who go through in vitro fertilization. There is genetic screening of the embryos, embryo screening, to check for diseases before implanting one of them. But while they're checking, they can also check for the sex and implant only the embryo of the desired sex. That's 100% effective. It's easy to check for. There's another way that doesn't even require people to go through in vitro fertilization, sperm sorting. There's a company, it's a for-profit company in Fairfax, Virginia, that if you want to choose the sex of your child, they collect the sperm and they can separate, they run it through a machine, and the machine can separate the Y-bearing sperm from the X-bearing sperm and enable through artificial insemination, use the sperm of the desired sex. And it's pretty effective, 91% effective for those who want girls, about 75% for those who try for boys. So what about sex selection? And by the way, Secretary Glickman will be interested to know that this technique, this sperm sorting machine, was first developed, guess where? In the Department of Agriculture for breeding cattle. But some smart entrepreneurs saw a bigger market. They licensed the technology, and now they let people choose the sex of their kids. Now, the bigger question for the wider society is, how would social practices and the relation between parents and children be changed if people became accustomed to choosing the sex of their kids in advance, and for that matter, in principle, depending on how the genetic mapping goes, other genetic traits, height, hair color, eye color, propensity for obesity or dyslexia, or ultimately, this now borders into much more distant scenarios, intelligence or athletic prowess. There's a science fiction movie, Gattaca, which some of you may have seen. We have a short clip here just to give us an imaginative sense of what a routine practice of sex selection and selection for other genetic traits through embryo screening might look like. So if we have the clip, maybe you can run it now, then see what you think. So just first to get a sense of the distribution of opinion here, how many, let's just take the sex selection, just to make it simple, even before we get into the other traits. How many find sex selection, here we won't even talk about what legally permissible, how many find it morally okay, and how many are troubled by it? Let's start with that. How many of you find morally troubling the idea of choosing the sex of children in advance? And how many think it's okay? Two to one. All right, about 2 to 1. Now, here we have to delve into the reasons, to the arguments. Here's where it gets difficult. Now, some objections to genetic enhancement have often to do with safety, like the steroids. But let's put that argument aside just to focus on the ethical questions, because let's assume that one day these technologies could be made safe. Then what would the objection be? Well, some of this may come out in the discussion, but let me first consider one familiar argument against enhancement, in this case, sex selection. One worry is a worry about sex discrimination. We know there are a great many societies in the world where, if this technology existed, people would go for boys. And the sex discrimination, the prejudice against girls and against women would be technologically empowered and enforced. And that's already happened in many parts of Asia, in China, for example, in Korea, and in India. There's already been a very significant skewing of sex ratios. In China already, even without the technology borrowed from the USDA, they don't have that yet, but through sex-selective abortions, the ratio of boys to girls is 117 boys per 100 girls in China. There are parts of India, northern India, where the sex ratio is as high as 140 to 100 boys to girls. So that is one very serious objection to sex selection. Maybe some of you had that worry in mind. But the company that runs the sperm sorting business, which is called, the technology, by the way, is called Microsort. The Microsort people have a clever answer to the sex discrimination objection. They only let people use this service for purposes of family balancing, as they call it. You can't go in for it to stock up on all boys or all girls. Only if you already have an uneven mix in your family can you use it to try to get, if you have more boys than girls, you can use it for a girl and vice versa. Now, I don't know whether that was the result of this company's deep moral reflection on the dangers of sex discrimination or just protective public relations. But it provides a way of setting aside, for the sake of the moral inquiry, the very weighty and legitimate argument about sex discrimination. There is a second related objection about fairness that comes up with a lot of these. Imagine the memory enhancements becoming available. It would likely be expensive. Who would go in for it? Those who could afford it, those who cared about reaching the top of a very competitive society. So a second objection to a lot of these technologies is a fairness objection. Won't it exacerbate and even build into the genetic makeup of the population the gap between rich and poor? And that also is a weighty objection, but it's not an objection that goes intrinsically to the use of these technologies. Because we could imagine if they were fine otherwise, and we simply wanted to assure equal access and decided that it was important, we could provide publicly subsidized height enhancements or memory enhancements. In principle, we could address that objection, though in practice it might be, well, it might have as great a chance as having universal health care. So, but in any case, the question is there anything else apart from worries about fairness and discrimination that is, well, that accounts for the fact that 2/3 of us worry about this kind of practice? And here's my stab at making some sense of what is troubling beyond fairness and discrimination. I think it has something to do, though it reaches very far, this account, so you may not gravitate to it instantly. I think it has something to do with a certain access to a project that in many ways we're very committed to in modern societies, a project of mastery and control over nature, including now even human nature. There is an ethic since the Enlightenment that understands freedom as a kind of mastery over the world, over nature, and sees the extension of human control and even dominion as the working out of our freedom. But what our hesitation in the face of genetic enhancement and sex selection suggests may be connected to an understanding that that ethic by itself, that ethic of mastery and dominion, is incomplete, and that it has to live in tension with another ethic, an ethic that views at least certain important things in life, and maybe even including certain parts of nature and our nature, as gifts for which we're indebted, rather than as projects that we control. One way of describing, or at least naming this objection, would be to call it the hubris objection. And one way of explaining the way in which it's a hubris objection is to go back to the case of the sex selection, picking the genetic traits of children. The idea is this: to appreciate children as gifts is, at least to a certain point, to accept them as they come, not to cast them as objects of our design, or products of our will, or instruments of our ambition. Now, when we think about our friends, or partners, or spouses, we choose our friends and spouses at least partly on the basis of qualities that we find attractive. But we don't choose our children, and that's an important fact about them and about us. Their qualities are unpredictable, and even the most conscientious parents can't be held wholly responsible for the kind of child they have. Because of this, parenthood, more than other human relationships, teaches what a theologian and bioethicist William May calls an openness to the unbidden. This idea of an openness to the unbidden is gestures toward an ethic that is in tension with the other ethic I mentioned, the project of mastery and dominion. So the problem with the parents who are being invited in the Gattaca story to specify all of the traits of their children, the problem is not that the parents usurp the autonomy of the child they design. The child wouldn't otherwise choose his or her genetic traits. The problem lies in the hubris of the designing parents. And even if this disposition doesn't make them tyrants to their children, it disfigures the relation of parent and child, and it deprives the parent, never mind the effect on the kids, it deprives the parent of the humility and of the enlarged human sympathies that an openness to the unbidden can cultivate. Now, this may seem like a strange idea, because it is at odds with a certain ethic bound up with a picture of freedom to which we're committed. But consider, just to make it more intuitively plausible, a historic practice, not all that different from genetic engineering, eugenics. One way of casting the moral argument about an openness to the unbidden is to ask, was there anything wrong with eugenics after all? Now, it's true that the Nazis and Hitler gave eugenics a bad name because they carried it into genocide. Earlier in the 20th century, eugenics was a very respectable, in progressive circles, a respectable movement for reform. Theodore Roosevelt was an enthusiastic eugenicist. Margaret Sanger, an early feminist, was a eugenicist. The point of birth control, she said, was to increase the number of the fit rather than the unfit. So eugenics, it has a checkered career, a dark past, connected to forced sterilization and to genocide. But suppose we detached from eugenics the coercion. Suppose we detached from eugenics state imposition and control. Then, would it be okay? In fact, some would argue one way of seeing these modern technologies of genetic enhancement is as free market eugenics or privatized eugenics. Eugenics minus the coercion, minus the collective state imposition. And so, what's wrong with eugenics then, if it's freely chosen in the market? Now, if I've correctly identified what bothers us about genetic enhancement, its sin is the same sin as the one bound up with eugenics. It isn't only the coercion. There is something objectionable to the project, to the very project of trying to extend our mastery and dominion and control to control the traits of our progeny, even if it's for their own good, even if it's not bound up with violence or coercion or state imposition. Now, why worry about any of this? Why worry about free market eugenics, for that matter, or genetic engineering? My argument would be this: both represent the one-sided triumph in our time of willfulness over giftedness, of dominion over reverence, of the desire to mold and control the world rather than to behold it and to observe certain restraints in the face of it. And by the world here, I mean nature and human nature. Why should we worry about this triumph? Why should we worry about giving up altogether on the openness to the unbidden? Well, there are two answers, and I'll conclude just by mentioning them. One answer comes from religion. From the standpoint of religion, to believe that our talents and powers are wholly our own doing is to play God. So some would say this objection would describe it as the playing God objection. But religion isn't the only source of reasons to care about giftedness or an openness to the unbidden. It's perfectly possible to describe the stakes in secular terms. Think about an important feature of our moral landscape, for example. Social solidarity, a sense of responsibility for those who may not land on top, but who find themselves at the bottom of society. The more alive we are to the chanced nature of our lot, to the contingencies that enable some of us to get ahead, the more reason we have to share our fate with others. Why, after all, do the successful owe anything to the least advantaged members of society? The best answer to this question depends, sometimes though we don't fully work it out or realize it, on some notion of the gifted or chanced nature of our talents. This then is the connection between social solidarity, mutual responsibility, and a sense of the contingency or gifted character of our talents. Those who retain a sense of the contingency of their gifts, who know that we're not wholly responsible for our own success, are more likely to take a more generous stance toward those who lack the talents that enable people to give ahead. So giftedness saves a meritocratic society like ours from sliding into the smug assumption that the rich are rich because they're more deserving than the poor. And what would happen if genetic engineering enabled us to override the results of the genetic lottery, to replace chance with choice? This is just a speculation, but it might turn out that the gifted character of human powers and achievements would recede, and with it, perhaps, our ability to see ourselves as sharing a common fate. The successful would become even more likely than they are now to view themselves as self-made and self-sufficient, and hence wholly responsible for their own success. Those at the bottom would no longer be viewed as disadvantaged and so worthy of a measure of compensation for their bad luck, but simply as unfit and so worthy of eugenic repair. The meritocracy, less chastened by chance, would become harder and less forgiving. That's speculation. It's a kind of speculative moral anthropology, maybe, but it's a way of trying to flesh out the consequences for a society and for a social ethic of giving up altogether on an appreciation of the sense in which we're indebted, whether to God or to chance or to the genetic lottery, for the talents that enable some of us to get ahead and that leave others behind. So the ethic, this fragile, difficult to articulate ethic that I've described as a certain openness to the unbidden, it seems to me underlies and is necessary to the deepest objections to genetic engineering and enhancement. Or that at least is my proposal to you, and we'll see in the discussion whether you find it an inviting suggestion.
We're going to ask both of our other guests to comment for about 5 minutes each, either responding to Professor Sandel or giving their own remarks on this subject. First, we have Professor Steven Pinker, who is a professor in the psychology department at Harvard. He's authored 6 books, including The Language Instinct, How the Mind Works, and The Blank Slate. He's written frequently for the New York Times, for Time, and Slate. He has won many book prizes, and we are privileged to welcome to the forum Professor Pinker.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to begin by thanking the Institute of Politics for the opportunity to participate in this fascinating discussion, and to express my appreciation for the thoughtful and lucid presentation by Professor Sandel, who offers much clarity, calm, and good sense in this vexed set of issues. But as someone who is a bit closer to the behavioral genetics and cognitive neuroscience, I have a somewhat different perspective on a number of these issues. A lot of current bioethics is animated by the belief that science has a way of quickly outstripping our moral resources for dealing with it, and that technologies such as nuclear power, genetic engineering, and cloning appear without advance warning and leave us ethically flat-footed. So it's better to try to work out the moral implications now before these brave new world technologies are upon us. My own view is that in this case, this may be backwards, and that much current bioethics is actually radically outrunning the science, and that many of the bioethical debates are the equivalent of debates about a Jetsons-like world of nuclear-powered vacuum cleaners and domed cities and jetpack commuting and robot maids. That is, debates about developments that may never happen. And in particular, what I have in mind is human genetic enhancement. Now, some kinds of human genetic enhancement, indeed some kinds of private eugenics, have always been with us. Anyone who's been turned down for a date has been a victim of the human drive to control the genetic composition of one's children. But I think what we're talking about here is other kinds of control over the genes of one's children. I have no doubt that we will see an expansion of pre-implantation screening for single gene defects. We already have it for cystic fibrosis. We may have it for Huntington's disease. And no doubt it will occur as we come to understand single gene defects better. But I think it'll always be easier to weed out negative traits than to select for or insert positive ones by the simple laws of probability that whenever you have a complex system, such as a human body, it'll always be easier to bring it down with one defective part than to improve it by adding a well-engineered part. When it comes to enhancing humans, to designer babies, I'm actually skeptical that we're going to see it in our lifetimes, say by inserting genes for musical, athletic, or intellectual ability. First fact, let's take identical twins who share all of their genes, who are in effect clones. Now, you all know that there are often astonishing correlations in the personalities and intellects of identical twins, anywhere in the neighborhood of correlations of 0.25 to 0.75, let's say on average 0.5. Well, that's very high compared to the correlations among fraternal twins who share only half their genes, and higher still than correlations among unrelated people. And it shows that, indeed, genes matter. But 50% is much, much less than 100%. It means, for example, that one identical twin can be gay and another one can be straight, or one can be schizophrenic and the other one normal. So this sets a rather low upper bound for how well the best genetic enhancement, that is, controlling all of a baby's genes, is likely to shape the baby. By the way, it also sets a low upper bound on how well everything else is likely to shape the baby, such as parents, siblings, peers, neighborhoods, schools, and so on, because those are also shared by identical twins brought up together, who nonetheless correlate only about 50%. But it means that this aspect of the unbidden, I think, is always going to be with us, no matter how good genetic engineering turns out to be, or whether it's possible at all. What it suggests is that there's an enormous role of chance in human development. Chance in the development of the brain in utero, whether the growth cones of some axons zigged or zagged on a particular day of development. perhaps chance events as the baby grows up and lives its life, whether it was dropped on its head, whether it inhaled a virus, whether it was set off on a train of thought one day for some unpredictable reason which had permanent consequences. A second fact, the substantial heritability of human intelligence is as well established as any finding in the human sciences. So what that shows is that our 35,000 odd genes play an important role in the functioning of our brains. At the same time, there's been something of a paradox that no one has yet identified a single gene that's correlated with high intelligence. 35,000 genes, yes. One gene, no, or not yet. It's because a genome isn't a bag of traits where each trait has one gene. Genes combine in unfathomably complicated ways. The effect of one gene depends on the expression of many other genes. That means that even if musical talent is heritable, one shouldn't hold one's breath for the musical talent gene that can be inserted into an embryo. Here's a third fact. Most genes have multiple effects. It's a phenomenon that geneticists call pleiotropy. So take the poster mouse for genetic enhancement, the so-called Doogie Howser mouse that had extra copies of the NMDA receptor knocked into it and as a result was better able to learn and remember. This mouse also had hypersensitivity to inflammatory pain, a trade-off that most of us would certainly not choose for our children. Likewise, there has been a gene that may be associated with a 10-point IQ boost on average. On the other hand, it's also associated with a 10% greater risk of torsion dystonia, which confines a person to a wheelchair with uncontrollable muscle spasms. And I'll mention a fourth point. There's a famous quotation from Wallace Simpson that you can't be too rich or too thin. Maybe you can't be too smart, but other traits aren't like that. There are optimal intermediate values. So take assertiveness. I think most parents wouldn't want their child to be a wimp or a doormat, but they wouldn't want their child to be Vlad the Impaler either. Take fear and boldness. You wouldn't want a child who is cowering behind your leg all their life, but you don't want a candidate for the Darwin Awards. So even if there's a gene that had some predictable, reliable effect, which itself is far from certain, whether it would be desirable might depend on what the other 34,999 genes in the genome are doing, something that we're not going to figure out anytime soon. So for this reason, I think it's somewhat misleading to assume that parents will soon face the question, would you opt for a procedure that would give you a more talented or happier child? I think the real question is more likely to be something like, would you opt for a traumatic and expensive procedure that might give you a slightly more talented child, might give you a less talented child, might give you a deformed child, and might make no difference at all? I think that's more likely to be the choice, and it's not clear that hundreds of millions of people would say yes to it. Now, this isn't just a question of optimism or pessimism, but I think it actually has consequences for policy, namely whether we should set restrictions now on this general family of research techniques. And I think much depends on the perceived inevitability of human genetic enhancement. There's one metaphor that this is a runaway freight train that is just inevitably going to do harm unless it's stopped now with great force. But there's another metaphor that this is like the great-grandchild of your newborn baby, and that any decision that you're going to make about its options is bound to be the wrong one because you have so little information now as to how it's likely to turn out. My final remark is that I think we also have to be wary of a general yuck factor when it comes to confronting new medical technologies. Throughout the history of medicine, there are technologies that are now completely unexceptionable that in their day were thought of as breaching some natural order. Vaccination was considered a moral abomination. Blood transfusions. In the 50s, as recently as the 50s, artificial insemination. In the 70s, in vitro fertilization, fluoridation of water, and so on, all of which were considered moral issues in their days. Now we see how much they enhance human health and happiness, and the idea that they ever had a moral dimension almost seems rather quaint. So when it comes to the general way in which the topic was framed this evening, or at least it was framed by the editors of the Atlantic Monthly on the cover, the case against perfection, it seems to me that it's a misleading way of framing the issues. A human being is a staggeringly improbable arrangement of matter, constantly teetering on the brink of disintegration. The second law of thermodynamics is relentlessly picking away at our physical organization. Every part of our bodies was designed by natural selection to be vigorous and disposable rather than serviceable and permanent. And there are billions of rapidly evolving microbes that are from whose point of view you are a big, yummy mound of gingerbread there for the eating, and they're constantly figuring out ways to eat you from the inside. And as the bumper sticker says, stuff happens. There are accidents, there are mutations. Think of the number of catastrophic things that could logically happen to you in the next 24 hours. It's an awfully long and depressing list.
This is all very comforting.
Or you could take your antioxidants tonight. That might slow it down a little bit.
That's exactly right. In the face of these staggering odds of an indifferent universe, I would suggest that anything that gives us a leg up in this struggle, that increases our odds by some increment, should be welcomed. And I think that perfection is the least of our worries.
Thank you. That was an appetizing discussion. Anyway, our last guest tonight is Brent Coffin, who directs the Joint Program on Religion and Public Life, which is a collaborative initiative between the Hauser Center here at the Kennedy School and the Harvard University's Divinity School. He is a member of the Hauser Center's Intellectual Foundations Project, The Social Role of the Faith-Based Organizations. He was executive director of the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life at Harvard's Divinity School, and from 2000 to 2001, he directed the Divinity School's program on religion, civil society, and democracy. We're happy to have you, Mr. Coffin.
Thank you. I want to add my thanks for tonight, for this forum and this fascinating topic. I like Professor Sandel's argument very much and want to push it. It seems to me it's essentially a moral argument, not a predictive argument about what's going to happen in the future. Given that we already have performance-enhancing drugs and we'll have more, given that you already have technologies for genetic engineering, we'll have more, given that we as parents already aspire to raise superior children who are able to get into Harvard, and will expect much more of them after that, the question is that Professor Sandel is posing, what are our moral intuitions about this ever greater tendency toward hyper-agency, toward self-created superiority? Professor Sandel assumes that most of us have a moral unease about it. I do. And why is this the case? He argues in the article that autonomy, fairness, and rights do not adequately explain this sense of moral unease. I agree. The deeper problem is this aspiration to hyper-agency that may in some way be a distortion of our present humanity and our relation to the non-human natural world. It's not that the cultivation of our natural talents or the improvement of our well-being is by any means wrong. Rather, it's this drive to mastery, this quest for perfection, may in some way be incompatible with other elements that make us human beings. Humility, sympathy, openness to the unbidden, accepting love as well as achieving love. Again, I agree. And what I find most interesting about Professor Sandel's article is where he takes us in his account of why it's important to consider these moral sentiments like humility and sympathy and solidarity. A more adequate account of why we should think about these things and be concerned about an ethics of enhancement or mastery moves us beyond analytical moral philosophy and puts on the table the question, the sorts of persons we are in relation to each other. To speak of the gifted quality of human life that evokes sentiments like wonder or gratitude or humility is perhaps to speak of religious sensibilities. And this is indeed to expand the range of philosophical discourse as it's normally practiced. I welcome this, although I suppose Michael's colleagues may be suspicious of it. I want to push it a bit farther. Accounting for this moral unease over self-mastery presses us to reflect upon our status as human beings. Professor Sandel says these questions verge on theology, and I want to move across that boundary for a moment. His argument stays within the domain of moral philosophy, but I'm left wondering if he has fully made the case. Some people may have good genetic inheritance, but why regard this as a gift? Why is chance gift? Why isn't it just good luck? Why should we cultivate sentiments of humility and sympathy and not just be glad we're winners? For the last 5 years or so, I've been part of a group that meets every 2 weeks during the academic year that studies Torah and social justice. As a Protestant Christian, I'm the token Gentile in the group. In our last session, we read the texts in Genesis. God creates the natural world and blesses it. God creates human beings and blesses them. What is it to know and experience the world and ourselves as blessed? And what is lost when blessedness becomes self-mastery? In the Christian tradition, this quest for perfection has been viewed as the quintessential expression of sin, superbia, pride, the claim that one is more valuable and therefore more deserving than others. Reinhold Niebuhr has said that the Christian notion of sin is the one empirically verifiable belief in the Christian tradition. And of this particular notion, he says there's 3 classical forms of superbia. One is the pride of power. Because we are more powerful than others, we believe ourselves to be more valuable and therefore justified in using our power for our own well-being at the expense of the less powerful. Second is the pride of knowledge. Because we believe we know more than others, we have a superior claim to use that knowledge for our ends without the voice of others. Third, and the highest form of sin, according to Niebuhr, is spiritual pride. The belief that our virtue, our goodness, our righteous cause makes us more worthy than others in the eyes of God. Now, the quest for perfection, in other words, is part of ancient tradition's account of the human predicament. There are then new alternatives, but as Niebuhr said, every new alternative and option for good is an equal potential for evil. So what's wrong then with this new potential for self-creating perfection? Let me conclude by saying, among other things, it may very well be self-defeating. The perfect may be the enemy of the blessed. Luther describes sin as the human heart or intentionality turning in upon itself. An autonomous human being in pursuit of perfection may be a conscious human agent living in a world of mirrors. Each task, each relationship, each rung on the career ladder reflects the quest towards superbia. Some of these reflections will be exhilarating, confirming superiority. But this mirror of the self-creating self also reflects troubling shadows. Still superior? Compared to whom? How much more? In other words, the dark shadows of self-contempt and contempt for others. The persistent demand to be recognized as superior may, in the end, elicit only the echoes of its own voice. So the project of the quest for perfection may estrange us from our very own humanity, those very qualities that allow us to be in communion with others. Humility, sympathy, forgiveness, gratitude. It may estrange us from blessedness. Now let me conclude by saying, having read this article and agreed with the case, I then realized that there's this troubling statement in the New Testament, "Be you perfect as God in heaven is perfect." And as a Christian in the middle of Holy Week, I realized this could pose something of a contradiction to the argument that I'm trying to make tonight. But it also may not, because this particular command is said in the context of 5 verses of a classic text that talk about love. Perfection in this context means wholeness or undividedness. It applies not to self-creating individuals, but to individuals in a community. And it applies not to the existing state of our performance, but to the telos, or the end that we ought to seek as a community. And the way that we move toward this goal is not by focusing upon the incessant demand for self-improvement, but by practicing self-transcending regard toward others. Others in the community and also outside the community who challenge our interests and who deny our claims of superiority, that is, our enemies. Now, Niebuhr described this self-transcending love as the impossible possibility. Impossible because we do need to cultivate our talents and to constantly deal with the contingencies that affect us as vulnerable human beings. And in doing so, the impossibility is that we're always tempted to drink that intoxicating sense of superbia. But it's also possible, and I think we experience it every day. A mother who looks in the eyes of a newborn child, not for perfection. A professor who reads a text with empathic understanding and lets it speak to us in a way that changes our thinking. A student who leaves the heady environment of Harvard to work in an after-school program. So as a theologian, I would say perhaps we can't help but love. The question is, what is worthy of our love? And how do we deal with the plight that binds us together, which is no small kind of solidarity, namely that however much we try, we all fall short. Thank you for the article.
Yeah. Thank you. You know, I know that we have a lot to discuss here. I'd like to get to questions because I think that the panelists can respond to each other a bit in questions. But I would like to tell you a quick little story. When I was secretary, I went to a place called Highgrove west of London to visit Prince Charles. And Prince Charles was very, very involved in organic agriculture. And he had a farm called Highgrove, and it was a farm that basically did not use pesticides, herbicides, no genetic engineering whatsoever. So I went to visit his farm, and he was not a vegetarian. He had animals there as well, but didn't believe in any of this newfangled genetic engineering. And so afterwards, we sat down inside there and had a lovely lunch, and he was extremely nice. And we started talking about genetic engineering, and he says to me, he thinks it's wrong. And we got into a discussion, and finally I said, well, God didn't put us on this earth just to accept everything as it is. He gave us a brain to try to make changes. And I'll never forget, Prince Charles looked at me and he says, Secretary, what does God have to do with this? And it always kind of struck me that it presents both sides of this thing a little bit, that I've thought about it over and over and over again. as I've thought about this particular issue. Why don't we go to questions? We have 2 mics here and a mic there and a mic there. I'd ask you to keep your questions as brief as possible. State your name, where you're in school. You can direct the question to any of our guests or to all of them if you wish. And I'm going to start right here.
My name's Chris Clearfield. I'm a junior at the college. And this is a question that I hope will sort of keep all the panelists happy. But I'd like to kind of ask if we can reframe the debate a little bit in terms that I think both preserve the moral arguments and are a little more contemporary. So I feel like I'll try to keep this brief. I feel like if we remove the genetic aspect of it and just deal with treatment, like strength-enhancing treatments, intelligence-enhancing treatments, sort of leave out side effects like we did in our assumptions here, then we still end up with some of the fundamental arguments that you brought up, Professor Sandel, in terms of what we're running against morally and how we're able to enforce the gap between rich and poor, et cetera. So if we accept that post-birth treatments pose the same sort of moral questions and argue that some sort of natural state is a better state than some sort of not genetically but pharmaceutically enhanced state, then I'd like to ask about cancer treatment, which I think is, so right now we have a pretty blunt instrument to treat cancer, which just kills all cells, basically. And so if we try to develop a more focused cancer treatment, are we not sort of moving in a direction that's leading us to some movement away from an imperfection that's present in our systems?
Whoever wants to take this.
Well, I'd be for the cancer treatment, genetic or otherwise. And that would depend on distinguishing between, you would need some notion, can't avoid some notion of what human health and human flourishing is. And so you can redress. My argument is not simply to enshrine and sanctify nature as given, because then we couldn't eradicate smallpox, we couldn't combat cancer. So some distinction between restoring or repairing impediments to human health as against turning children or ourselves really into articles of consumer choice. That would be the distinction I would make. Can I put to Professor Pinker
Sure.
a quick question that has to do with this? Now, Steve, some of your worry was that a lot of this is unlikely to succeed, and that was the predictive part, Grant was saying. But then another strand of this was, it's unlikely to succeed, but by the way, if it did, it would be just fine with me. And so I'd like to take it one where there's no speculation about the success in already existing practice. In 1980, there was a guy, a crazy eugenic philanthropist, who set up one of the first sperm banks. It was the Nobel Prize Sperm Bank. Do you remember reading about that?
Oh, yes.
Where he wanted to recruit sperm donors only from Nobel Prize winning scientists. And he would make them available to very smart women. And his idea was to elevate, he was an idealist. He wanted to elevate the human race by doing this. His project didn't succeed that well. He wasn't able to find very many of these Nobel scientists who would contribute or who were in a condition to contribute.
Well, then he developed Viagra then, right? Afterwards.
So then he had to compromise and recruit young, promising scientists for his project. But in any case, just to put directly to my friend Steve, what do you think of that sperm bank? Is that fine?
Well, I'll tell first an anecdote about that sperm bank. Where one of the people not a personal anecdote. One of our late colleagues, George Wald, the brilliant biochemist, was asked to contribute. And he wrote a very polite letter saying, well, if you want a sperm that leads to Nobel Prize winners, you should be polling people like my father, who was an impoverished Russian immigrant tailor. What if my sperm produced 2 no-good guitarists?
But, so you're not worried?
I guess I'm not worrying. Again, it's a little bit, some of these questions I think are like worrying about the ethics of what's going to happen when everyone commutes by jetpack. In that, one huge impediment is that people vastly, I think, would like to have a child with their spouse. For one thing, people, I think, would like to have a father to their child who's going to help bring it up, and most fathers would rather bring up, if given a choice, a child that's genetically related to themselves rather than to a Nobel Prize winner that they selected out of a catalog. So I suspect that practically, even if there were such banks, that they would not catch on. But I'll give a more general, I understand the thrust of your question. I'll give my general answer, which would be modified depending on the details of the case. But in general, I would think there'd be a high threshold for restricting any voluntary choice that doesn't lead to actual harm to the immediate participants. So I would distinguish the case of enhancement in sports, for example, where third parties are the raison d'etre for sports. They're the audience, they're paying the bills. I think that sports leagues can regulate as much as they want. They can probe any orifice of any athlete to make sure that they're not on enhancing substances, and I have no problems with that, simply because it's all for the benefit of the spectators. They have a right to whatever aesthetic and emotional spectacle they're paying for. And on the other hand, when it comes to individuals, whether third parties should have a say in their decisions to treatment or to mating, I guess I would want there to be a very, very strong argument, not based on any kind of aesthetic reaction, not based on any appeal to overall human wisdom, which I think is better worked out by the individual in terms of the trade-off. And I would guess I would be have a classical liberal, autonomous individual rights orientation to almost all of these questions, unless there was some concrete thing that was that led to identifiable harm. And I'll just to bring it to the original question. I think it's a completely appropriate question to pose it in terms of specific treatments that reduce human suffering. That when we talk about general desiderata like wisdom in the face of the unpredictable, humility, limits on our control, we always have to pit those against real suffering from real human beings. I have no doubt that if I had a chronic toothache, I'd probably be, in some sense, more philosophical, wiser, more humble, have a greater appreciation of the role of chance and misfortune in human life. But I'd rather not have the toothache. I'd rather be that much less wise, that much more callow, and live a more comfortable, healthy life with less suffering. And in a lot of these debates, I would want to see an argument that there's a flaw in that reasoning.
You could also be cranky and mean.
With the toothache?
Right.
Yes, but maybe not. Maybe I'd be so philosophical and so appreciative, like Job.
Okay, up there, this gentleman here. Again, let's try to keep our questions as brief as we can.
Sure. My name is Matthew Meisel. I'm a freshman at the college. Professor Sandel, you argued against these kinds of expensive genetic measures before birth that might have a high likelihood at some point in the future of increasing an individual's lot or increasing their chances at a very good life, however we define that, intellect, strength, etc. But what then about measures that parents take soon after birth? Expensive environmental measures such as maybe sending them to an elite private school that might also increase their chances. And what kind of distinction is there? I don't have the same kind of moral unease about that.
Right. It's a great question. And one of the arguments in defense of genetic enhancement is, look, parents go through great strenuous efforts through educational and environmental means, very expensive efforts sometimes, to provide the best for their kids, whether it's tutoring or soccer lessons or tennis camp. So why should we draw the line at genetic enhancement if it could, even in principle, produce the very same effects that we seem content with in the other case? I think there is an analogy. I would agree with you. There is an analogy between a certain kind of parental ambition for their kids, sometimes a very overbearing ambition, it can be, and the same kind of overbearing ambition for children that leads to these kinds of cultivations and sometimes molding of children environmentally. But I think that analogy can work both ways. It can make us more sympathetic to the genetic enhancement, or when you consider the kind of overbearing hyper-parenting that is increasingly common, it might lead us to reflect on the desirability and even the ethical status of a kind of environmental hyper-parenting, overbearing parenting that is reaching really epidemic proportions. Consider the example of the father of Venus and Serena Williams, the great tennis player. Now, reportedly, he chose their tennis career for them before they were born. There was no genetic enhancement, there was no Gattaca scene, but he had this ambition. He read about what a vehicle this could be, this tennis career, and according to some accounts, one of the reasons that he had them was the hope of creating, and he succeeded. He succeeded in creating the greatest women tennis champions in the world. Now, does that analogy vindicate genetic enhancement, or does it call into question the hyper-parenting, the overbearing parenting that is rife on the sidelines of soccer fields all across this country, if you ever go there, to say nothing of the role that some parents play now college, trying to get their kids in, paying huge amounts to, you remember the guy Jack Grubman, who altered his stock rating to curry favor with his boss. This was a couple of years ago. He changed the rating on AT&T stock to curry favor with his powerful boss because his boss was helping getting his twin 2-year-olds into the 92nd Street Y nursery school, which was very prestigious in Manhattan. And so there is something, I think, in the culture, a kind of revved up a set of pressures and hyper-parenting that I think may not be all that discontinuous with the drive for genetic enhancement.
Up here, right there.
My name's Nathan Rosenberg. I'm a junior at the college. How is the debate different if it turns out that we actually can't create any sort of superhuman characteristics through genetics? All we can do is somehow take what nature has given us and, as Professor Pinker said, take the negatives away, really only fulfill people's natural potential. Does it change it whether that's the case or whether we're superhuman? Any of you?
Either one of you.
Well, I think
Or anybody.
it does make, if we're talking about realizing the potential, unfolding a life of a child or an adult, and removing obstacles of health, whether it's cancer or a toothache, then I think that does have a very different status from trying to change the nature for the sake of improvement to make a person better than well. And, or for that matter, to choose the sex of the child, that's not for the child's benefit. It's not for the sake of curing any illness. Being, when they chose a brother for young Vincent in Gattaca, they weren't curing a disease. They were exercising really a consumer preference. And so the question is, what is the great ethical weight or ethical interest in letting people satisfy consumer preferences, even where it involves ordering up children of a certain sex?
Professor Pinker, you want to?
Well, I guess there's another way of putting it, which is instead of what is the ethical weight of letting them do it, if we start off from with general democratic principles that people should be free to do what they want unless they harm someone else, I would invert the question and say, what is the ethical imperative to prevent them from doing it, given that we're in a society that is not totalitarian that asks the question, what should people be allowed to do, but rather, what should people be prohibited from doing?
Right. I would say that's not a democratic principle, that's a libertarian principle. And so underlying the case is there is a certain libertarian view that puts great emphasis, as you've done, on autonomy and choice, which is why I'd like, even before we get to the question of what should the law be or what should regulations be, just what are your gut instincts? That's why I was curious to know what you thought, not whether we should ban that philanthropic eugenicist Nobel sperm bank, but just what do you think about it? Or take the case of being turned down for a date on eugenic grounds. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should ban.
Are you asking him out right now or not?
I want to know, and I'm not saying should we ban people dating on eugenic grounds, but I am interested to know, Steve, what if you have a friend, suppose a friend comes to you and says, she says, I was in love with that guy, but I can't go out with him. I don't want to get serious about him because, let's say, he's short and I want tall kids. Just what would you say to that friend? Would you admire them more when you heard about that? You wouldn't say, well, in a free society we shouldn't censor that person or throw them in jail. That's not the issue. Do you admire it? Do you think they're missing something?
Well, I think
you think they're callow?
I think they would be callow, but I also think, I would distinguish very sharply that question, namely how, in judging someone as a friend or as a person, I should answer that question, with the policy question of should the government have be asked their opinion in this matter.
Fair enough, but why would you, even in your private judgmental capacity, consider them callow?
Yes.
Why would you?
Well, because out of concern for their own long-term happiness, I would say that the value of physical appearance becomes less important as a relationship deepens, that it becomes less important as one falls in love with one's children, sees them develop as individuals, and that this would be an unwise weighting of a fairly superficial and short-lived set of considerations compared to what, if you'll pardon the expression.
Dr. Coffin, you want to comment?
I want to pick up on one of the assumptions, I think, in your question, and that is when you ask about improving the quality of life, what is the unit of life that we have in mind? And I don't want to get into the policy debate, whether the market best regulates or whether the state regulates, but I think when we start using market logic, we have presumed that the unit is individual decision makers. And I think one of the reasons why I like this article is that it frames the bionic athlete and the genetic engineering questions within the context of an intensively achievement-oriented meritocracy. And one of the questions that places squarely on the table for me is those of us that are caught in the logic of achievement have a very difficult time being available to one another, much less available to others that are not in our prestigious, achievement-oriented environments. And therefore, this whole quality of social awareness, social solidarity that leads towards even a policy discussion, much less enlightened policy debates, is a very difficult thing to make place for. So what is the unit of a good life? Is it only the individual? Is it more than that?
Yes, this gentleman here. We're going to probably not have a lot of time for questions. I'm going to try to go to 9:30, but we'll take as many as we can.
Steve Helfer, staff member, law school. When I was a youngster, it seems to me that I saw many more persons with Down's syndrome. In the last several decades, it seems to me that their numbers have diminished greatly in our society. I assume it's because of elective abortion. My question to the panel is does this reflect well on our society or ill on our society?
Professor Sandel, you want to start first, and we'll go down the...
All right, well, I'll start, and then if I could supplement that with a variation on the same question. I think that's a wrenching and tragic dilemma, the question of if you're right that abortion for Down syndrome accounts for that, then I do think it raises a serious moral question, even though there is a question that has to do with health. But yes, I see that as morally troubling. I'd like to add to that scenario a case that's, I think, harder for a libertarian even than the Down syndrome case, which involves arguably a matter of health. James Watson, who was one of the discoverers of the structure of DNA, created a furor a couple of years ago when he said if a gay gene were discovered and a woman decided she didn't want a gay child, she should have the right to abort. She should have a right to abort on the basis of not wanting the gay child, if a gay gene were found. And then there was a furor over this, and he said, well, I'm not singling out gays, I'm just asserting a general libertarian principle, though it was one that was closely connected to a certain eugenic sensibility. He said, for that matter, if there were a test for dyslexia in utero, and or obesity, and a woman decided she didn't want a dyslexic child, she should also have the right. Now, I'm not one of those who is against abortion. There are some who are against abortion under all circumstances. I'm not one of them. But I do find morally troubling abortion for what amount essentially to eugenic reasons. And I think it's a hard test for a straight libertarian view.
Professor?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it is morally complex, although I think abortion is morally complex, although like you, I'm in favor of it being allowed. I'm not sure, given that most of the people in this room, if faced with that knowledge and that decision, I think a large number of people would abort a child whose pre-genetic screening indicated Down syndrome. Given the huge number of abortions that are done for far more frivolous reasons, just it's not time to have a child, and it's the same life that's being sacrificed. Even though I don't think it can be done with moral equanimity. I don't think it's a trivial moral decision. I think it's one that we would have no right to prohibit. And there is something sad and wistful about this. But given that when it came to anyone's decision, that's the one that they would make, and it's hard to justify any third party saying that they shouldn't, given that abortion is allowed in the first place, then I would say that we don't have any option then to live with that outcome.
And would you say the same for sex or sexual orientation?
I mean, I would be more, the ambivalence that I would feel would certainly be higher. I mean, on a scale from, say, birth control to abortion, to aborting a Down syndrome child, to aborting a child with dyslexia or homosexual tendencies, I would certainly get more.
Or a girl in many societies.
Certainly the moral discomfort would increase along that continuum. But the moral discomfort is not zero for abortion, and I think that abortion should be available on demand. The question is, how far do you go? And I would have to listen to arguments very carefully on both sides before deciding whether to outlaw that.
Dr. Coffin, you want to comment on this?
Well, just I think in this discussion, there's a certain tendency to move from the moral to the policy question and assume it's either a state regulation question or a private market choice question. And I think, in fact, that's not the way that a lot of these very agonizing moral dilemmas get made. They get made in networks of agonizing moral reflection. And I may not agree with a given choice, but I just want to point out those are not the two arenas in which these agonizing dilemmas get made.
Let's take just a couple more.
Well,
this gentleman here and this young lady here, and that'll be probably it for tonight. Yes, sir.
All right, my question was, Professor Pinker mentioned this earlier, I believe.
where take this case of schizophrenia or any mental illness for that matter, not necessarily not mental handicap, but a mental illness, something that might impair an otherwise healthy person from contributing very strongly to society. Would you? My question is to the panel then is: would you? How exactly would you see a case of eugenics for trying to root out a mental illness that might cause a person a great deal of pain and even cause them to harm themselves within the course of their lifetime?
By eugenics, you mean what? At
I
the
mean,
level of
I
the
mean,
embryo screening at that level?
Embryo screening, yes. I guess I should have been more specific.
Well, I think I would be uneasy about that, though that, I can see the arguments. I would be uneasy.
I would have no more problem with that than I would for abortion.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Mahalia Gale. I'm a graduate.
Can't hear you.
Hi.
Close to the
Is
mic.
that better?
Yeah.
Okay. My name is Mahalia Gale. I'm a graduate student at the college. I teach French. My question is, if some of these technologies are not redefining what mastery is. So if we were to say that mastery begins at the human body and we create lots of beautiful bodies, this does not touch on things that have to do with application, like taste, timing, knowing how to dress. So, for example, you talked about being turned down for dates for genetic reasons. I'm sure everybody has, you've heard of, you could say a nerd, okay? Somebody who is very intelligent, but who does not have certain social skills. And these are not genetic. So I'm wondering if by putting the emphasis on genetic solutions to problems like being a good-looking person, we're not neglecting other solutions, like learning how to act, which are not biological in nature. So this also ties into what you've said at the beginning about the Olympics. So if, let's say we were to create new athletes whose level, their top level, would destroy everything else that was beneath it, which is the regular human level, what's the point of the Olympics? I think part of the some things that have been admired in human achievement have to do with respecting the limits that we have and then exploiting things that can be controlled by the inner person. So that's one thing. And the other question has to do with what is suffering. So you talked about having toothache. If we were to push this to the limit, we could say that being ugly physically is a source of suffering. And so that by aborting such persons or preventing them from being born, we were actually, we would be performing a public service because those people would then not suffer from being taunted or, I don't know, ignored or, I don't know. So that's part of my other question because I read in, yeah.
All right, okay. Any comments on her?
On the part, to take the part about the Olympics and the enhanced athletes at the Olympics, this connects with part of the discussion we were having before about athletics. The picture of athletics as mere spectacle, as a consumer-driven spectacle, seems to me, anyhow, a very strange notion of athletics, of sport. I think actually the closer sports and athletics veers, as it does increasingly in our society, toward spectacle, the more degraded it becomes. And so, for example, what is that wrestling, that phony wrestling on TV? What's it called?
Where is Jesse Ventura when we need him?
Right. We have resources here at the IOP to discuss this subject. No, but what is it? The
professional wrestling, yeah. WWF?
The WWF. Yeah. I almost said the WTO, being at the Kennedy School. The WWF.
But that's not phony, that's serious acting. What's wrong
with
you?
Okay. That's a spectacle. And it's a spectacle by contrast with real wrestling, collegiate wrestling, for example, which is not a spectacle. It's an athletic competition with distinctive, characteristic excellences, integrities, so that just not anything that would please the spectator. And it probably doesn't. Collegiate wrestling probably doesn't attract the great turnout at the events, certainly of the World Wrestling Federation or even other sports. But I think there is a kind of degradation that is worked insofar as simply because the general population would flock to the event, the athletes are then permitted, even assuming it were safe, to alter themselves. And so I think that we can't detect
We've got
this
so
from
many
the
people
public.
need
Go ahead.
questions asked, so let's just hold it. You can talk to them afterwards. What I want to do is I want to go to everybody who's here, but I'm going to ask you to ask your question, and we'll move to the next person, and we'll get them all answered at the same time, if possible. So if you could try to be as brief as possible.
My name is Allison Connor. I'm a junior at the college. Many common adoption practices allow for parents to decide the sex of their child, as well as many physical characteristics. In open private adoptions, parents can meet the biological parents, and I was wondering if you draw a moral distinction between this and genetic engineering.
Okay, adoption. Right. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm alumni of the Kennedy School. I was wondering, Professor Sandel mentioned that removing obstacles to health has different status from making a person better than well. But technically speaking, if you could find if you're going to replace a gene that's bad with one that's good, you're going to find the best possible gene that you can find. So you're not just going to make someone well, you're going to find, not just make a healthy heart, you're going to find the gene that makes the best heart. So, you know what I'm saying? I don't see a real distinction, because you're not going to settle for a mediocre heart gene. You're going to settle for the A+ heart gene. You know what I'm saying?
Okay, got you. Yes, sir. Yeah, right. No. I'm for that gene, by the way. If you mind. Yes, all right. Yeah.
My question is a secular question, actually. Humans have been around for several million years, and if we're lucky, maybe 1,000 or another 10,000 years. So is there not a certain arrogance, when we're talking about hubris, is there not a certain arrogance in saying that us in year 2004 have a monopoly on what it means to be human? So if we make a decision today about what we ought to do and what we ought not to do, have we not tied our hands for what humans 1,000 years from now or 10,000 years from now might think is perfectly natural?
Okay. Yes, last question right here.
Professor Sandel, much of your argument hinged on the nature of chance and how that relates to our sense of giftedness. And so if we take out some of the chance in the genetic component, we're still left, as Professor Pinker talked about, with chance in social condition, with some chance due to environment, non-shared environments, and things of that sort. So if we take out one source of chance with the genetics, and we still have other chance, can we not still sense that giftedness with, we still have a chance of being wonderful or in a terrible condition due to other sources of chance?
Okay. I'll let you all answer any or all of these questions as you desire. Start with Dr. Coffin here.
Let me respond to this question about the kind of hubris of assuming that our moral judgments in 2004 are sufficient for the future. I think it goes back to Professor Pinker's acknowledgement that innovations in many historical periods have been very threatening and revolutionary, and they've been seen as immoral. I think that's a very good concern. But let me just bring back this question of attention. I think this is a discussion about attention we want to maintain. The issue of suffering. If we assume that suffering is purely evil and we ought to eliminate it, then the whole struggle is going to be to find every possible means to eliminate it. I would say that there's a way in which, along with trying to eliminate horrible kinds of suffering, there's another way in which suffering is part of the human condition, and it's our ability to cope with that, especially as you age, that in fact makes us fully human. So I think it's a question of attention and not a set of moral certitudes.
Professor Pinker?
I think that this really does crystallize, I think, a different viewpoint. I mean, I agree that suffering is always going to be part of the human condition. That's why I emphasized all of the ways in which we're so improbable that suffering is going to get us no matter what we do. But if we can reduce it, let's reduce it as much as possible, and hubris is good in that particular arena. We don't have to worry about a life without suffering. That's just never going to happen, but the less the better.
Professor Sandel?
I don't speak in defense of suffering. Even. Nor am I worried really about perfection. I'm more worried about the drive and the aspiration toward perfection. So I don't take great consolation in the fact, which I don't dispute, that we will never completely eradicate chance from human nature or human affairs. Because the problem is not that one day, in a more advanced state of Gattaca, they will really achieve a perfectly designed, perfectly predictable child. That's not the worry. If it were, then this would just be a utopian fantasy that we needn't pay any attention to. My worry is about the human dispositions that animate the drive to mold and to control and to exercise dominion over nature and over human nature. And that disposition can be a source of worry, whether its expression is of a high-tech kind, such as we've been mostly discussing, or even a low-tech kind of hyperparenting, as was raised earlier on. The adoption case that Allison raised is a very difficult case to answer. Because on the one hand, I would say up to a certain point, these sperm banks, not the Nobel Prize one, but sperm banks have caught on. They've caught on now as consumer free market enterprises. The eugenic philanthropist, he's out of business. But there's a sperm bank that advertises in the crimson. Perhaps it's found some recruits in this very audience. And there's no eugenic purpose. Cryobank it's called. And they're located, their offices are, their headquarters are halfway in Cambridge between Harvard and MIT, and in Palo Alto between Stanford and Berkeley. Now, that's not for eugenic purposes, but it is for marketing purposes. In fact, their donor catalogs play up the prestigious source of their Ivy League sperm. Now, it's not eugenic, it's free market. It's catering to consumer preferences. But morally speaking, what is the difference between trying to shape the genetic traits of our progeny for the crazy eugenic purposes that guy had when he started the Nobel Sperm Bank, or catering to what the market, what consumer demand, in its benighted tastes, in many cases, happens to want? Both are objectionable, and I think on comparable grounds. I'd like just to end, I know we're pressed for time, by addressing a point that Brent Coffin made that I thought was it's a hard question. I don't have an easy answer to it, but I don't want it to get lost completely. I thought I'd been venturing quite far in raising quasi-religious or moral questions for the public arena. But Brent Coffin wants to drag me further into the terrain of theology. I'm in enough trouble as it is. But the question he puts is, unless you carry this argument into the domain of theology, how can you answer the question, what kind of giftedness can there be without thinking about the giver of the gift? This is a theological question. Or as he put it, why humility and sympathy in the face of mere chance? That's a hard question. Luckily, we don't have enough time fully to answer it, but but here's just a hint of an answer. Why don't we just regard ourselves as lucky to have landed on top? Why should that inspire humility, unless there is a stronger theological assumption? I think even the weaker, more modest claim on behalf of preserving a lively sense of the contingency, the chance, even the evolutionary chance of our nature, does have a certain humbling effect in the face of a certain kind of conceit and pride. And it's brought out by a story, or by a line rather, that Ann Richards had when she was running for governor against then candidate for governor in Texas, George W. Bush. You remember she said, here's a fellow, Dan can imitate her voice better than I, so I won't try. Here's a fellow, George W. Bush. He was born on third base, and he thinks he hit a triple. So there is something to humility born even of chance.
Well, Let me make a couple. Those of you who have seen the movie The Boys from Brazil, I think it's an even more stark movie than Gattaca, because there they tried to not only deal with the genes, but then they remember they took these kids and put them in exact family circumstances that Adolf Hitler was in. And because they were trying to clone a Hitler, and they said you can't do it by genes alone. You got to do it by genes and environment. And fortunately, it ended where all the kids were, at least the movie ended where the kids didn't have any power or any role or anything else. But the thing that interests me with all this is it's fascinating discussion, but it will enter the public policy debate. It's already done it. In the world trading system, the biggest issue between the United States and the rest of the world right now has to do with the issue of genetic engineering as it relates to food. In the state legislatures and the federal legislatures today, the issues are cloning, stem cell research, and when life begins in terms of abortion. Witness even the Lacey Peterson legislation, which President Bush has signed into law. So these issues are, in fact, not hypothetical issues that we're just talking about academically from a theoretical base. These are issues that are important to legislators, and they cross-relate with the power of science as it deals with, I think, the resurgence of religion in this country, which when you get outside of maybe it's true here, but you get outside of this part of the country, you see a world in which religion is taking on a different and more assertive context in the area of public policy. Good or bad, I'm not to speak of that, but it's happening. And without this kind of intellectual debate, nobody can think through these issues and make the right decision. So I think this has been extremely valuable tonight. I appreciate your being here. Let's give them all a hand. Thanks for doing this. Thanks for that.